The blizzard hit Montana territory so hard that Willa Bennett could barely see her own hands clutching the reins of her dying horse. She had been riding for 3 days straight since fleeing the burning wreckage of her family's homestead, and now the mare beneath her finally gave out, collapsing into the snow with a pitiful whinny that cut through the howling wind. Willa tumbled forward into a drift, the cold biting through her worn coat like teeth. She scrambled to her feet, knowing that if she stayed still, she would freeze to death before dawn. Through the white curtain of falling snow, she could just make out the distant glow of what looked like a small settlement. Williams, maybe. She had heard other homesteaders mention a town by that name somewhere in this God-forsaken territory. Her legs burned as she pushed through knee-deep snow, each step a battle against the wind that threatened to knock her backward. The temperature had dropped so drastically that her breath froze in her lungs, making each inhalation painful. She was only 22 years old, but right now she felt ancient, every muscle in her body screaming for rest. The settlement grew closer, and she could make out individual buildings now, their windows dark except for a few that glowed with the warm promise of firelight and safety. The first door she reached belonged to a small house with smoke curling from its chimney. Willa pounded on the wooden door with numb fists, her knuckles barely able to feel the impact. She waited, counting her racing heartbeats, but no one came. The windows remained dark, and after a minute of desperate knocking, she realized either no one was home or they had decided not to answer to a stranger in the night. The second door was part of what looked like a general store. Willa hammered against it, calling out in a voice that sounded thin and desperate even to her own ears. Still nothing. The snow continued to fall, accumulating on her shoulders and in her dark hair, turning her into a ghost of herself. The third door belonged to a larger house with a white fence that was barely visible beneath the snow. Willa climbed the steps, slipping twice on the ice, and knocked hard enough that pain shot through her frozen hands. She pressed her ear to the door, listening for any sound of movement within. Nothing. The fear that had been simmering in her chest began to boil over into panic. The fourth door was part of a building that might have been a boarding house. Willa could hear voices inside, the murmur of conversation and laughter, which made hope surge in her chest. She knocked, then pounded, then kicked at the door with what little strength she had left. The voices continued, but no one came to answer. Perhaps they could not hear her over their own noise, or perhaps they simply chose to ignore the desperate pleas of a stranger. The fifth door belonged to what looked like a saloon, though the sign was covered in snow. Willa tried the handle, but it was locked tight. She beat against the wood until her hands bled, leaving small red smears that were quickly covered by fresh snow. The wind picked up, nearly knocking her off her feet, and she knew she was running out of time. The sixth door was part of a church, its white steeple barely visible against the dark sky. Surely a church would offer sanctuary, Willa thought desperately. She tried the door, but it was locked. She knocked and called out, but her voice was lost in the wind. The irony was not lost on her that a house of God would turn away someone in need, though she knew it was probably just that no one was there to hear her. The seventh door belonged to another house, this one smaller and more run down than the others. Willa could barely feel her feet anymore as she stumbled up to it and knocked. No answer came. The darkness behind the windows seemed to mock her, and tears froze on her cheeks as she turned away. The eighth door was part of what might have been a doctor's office, judging by the faded sign she could just make out. Willa threw herself against it, her desperation making her reckless. The door did not budge, and no light appeared in the windows. She slid down to sit on the steps for just a moment, knowing it was dangerous but unable to help herself. Her body was shutting down, conserving what little warmth it had left. With tremendous effort, Willa forced herself back to her feet. The ninth door belonged to another saloon or perhaps a gambling house. She could see light through the cracks around the door, could hear the faint sound of music. She knocked hard enough that her knuckles split open, blood mixing with the snow on her hands. But still, no one came. Perhaps they thought she was just the wind, or perhaps they simply did not care. The 10th door stood at the very edge of the settlement, part of a cabin that looked as worn and weary as Willa felt. It was set back from the other buildings, isolated and alone with a single window that glowed with dim firelight. This was her last chance. If no one answered this door, she would die in the snow before morning. Willa raised her hand and knocked, 3 solid strikes that echoed through the night. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then she heard footsteps, slow and heavy, approaching from inside. The door swung open, revealing a tall man silhouetted against the firelight. He had a rifle in one hand, pointed toward the ground, and his face was hidden in shadow. For a heartbeat, they simply stared at each other, Willa swaying on her feet and the man frozen in apparent surprise. "Please," Willa managed to whisper, her voice barely audible. "Help me." The man stepped forward and she could finally see his face. He was probably in his late 20s, with dark hair that fell past his collar and eyes that seemed to hold a deep, profound sadness. His face was rough and weathered from years in the sun and wind, with several days' worth of stubble on his strong jaw. There was something haunted about him, something that spoke of long years spent alone. "Christ," he muttered, setting the rifle aside and reaching out to catch Willa as her legs finally gave out. He was strong. She realized dimly as he lifted her easily, carrying her into the cabin and kicking the door shut behind them. The warmth of the fire hit her like a physical blow, making her gasp. The man set her down in a chair near the fire, then immediately began stripping off her wet coat. "You are half frozen," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "How long were you out there?" "I do not know," Willa admitted, her teeth chattering so hard she could barely speak. "My horse died. I knocked on 9 other doors. You are the only one who answered." Something shifted in the man's expression, a flicker of recognition or understanding. He did not say anything, just continued removing her wet things, tossing them aside and wrapping her in what looked like several wool blankets. Then he disappeared for a moment and returned with a cup of something hot. "Drink this," he ordered, holding it to her lips. It was coffee, strong and bitter, but it was the best thing Willa had ever tasted. The heat spread through her chest and down into her limbs, bringing with it a painful tingling as blood began to flow properly again. "Thank you," she managed when she had drained half the cup. Now that she was warming up and could think more clearly, she studied her rescuer more carefully. He was indeed tall, probably 6 feet or more, with broad shoulders and the lean, hard build of someone who worked with his hands. He wore simple clothes, a dark shirt and worn pants, and moved with an economy of motion that suggested someone used to being alone. "What is your name?" the man asked, crouching down in front of her so they were at eye level. Up close, Willa could see that his eyes were a striking shade of gray, like storm clouds, and that he had a small scar cutting through his left eyebrow. "Willa Bennett," she said. "I had a homestead about 3 days' ride from here. Or I did have one. It burned down. Raiders came in the night, killed my father and brother, took everything we had. I barely escaped." The man's jaw tightened and his eyes grew even harder. "I am sorry for your loss," he said, and something in his tone made Willa believe he truly meant it, that he understood what it was like to lose everything. "What is your name?" she asked. He hesitated for a moment as if he had to remember. "Thomas Fletcher," he finally said. Most people around here just call me Fletcher when they call me anything at all." "Why did you answer the door when no one else would?" Willa asked, wrapping her hands around the warm cup. Thomas stood up and moved to the fire, staring into the flames. "Because I know what it is like to need help and have no one answer," he said quietly. "I would not wish that on anyone, no matter what the weather or the hour." There was a story there, Willa could tell, something painful that had carved those sad lines into Thomas Fletcher's face and put that haunted look in his eyes. But she was too tired and too grateful to push for details now. Instead, she just sat wrapped in the blankets, slowly warming up, and studied the cabin around her. It was small and sparsely furnished, with just the basics needed for survival. A bed in one corner, a table with 2 chairs, a few shelves holding supplies, and a handful of books. There were no personal touches, no photographs or decorations, nothing that spoke of a life fully lived. It was the home of someone who existed but did not truly live, someone who had given up on anything beyond mere survival. "You can sleep in the bed," Thomas said, still staring at the fire. "I will take the floor." "I cannot take your bed," Willa protested. "You have already done so much." "You will take the bed," Thomas said, and there was no room for argument in his tone. "You have been through hell and you need proper rest. I have slept on worse than my own floor, believe me." Willa was too exhausted to argue further. With Thomas's help, she made her way to the bed and collapsed onto it, still wrapped in blankets. The mattress was thin and the bed narrow, but it felt like heaven after 3 days of riding and then fighting through the blizzard. She watched through heavy-lidded eyes as Thomas spread a bedroll on the floor near the fire, then lay down on it fully clothed, his rifle within easy reach. "Thank you," Willa whispered into the darkness. "You saved my life tonight." "Go to sleep," Thomas said gruffly. "We will figure out what to do in the morning." Willa wanted to say more, to ask more questions, but sleep pulled her under like a tide, and she surrendered to it gratefully. When Willa woke, gray light was filtering through the cabin's single window, and the smell of cooking bacon filled the air. She sat up slowly, her body one massive ache, and found Thomas standing at the stove, working on what looked like breakfast. He had shaved at some point, revealing the strong lines of his jaw, and had changed into a clean shirt. "How long was I asleep?" Willa asked, her voice hoarse. "About 14 hours, Thomas said without turning around. "The blizzard finally stopped a few hours ago, left about 3 feet of new snow." Willa swung her legs over the side of the bed and tested her weight on them. Everything hurt, but she could stand. She made her way over to the table and sat down, accepting the plate of bacon and eggs that Thomas set in front of her. "I do not know how to repay you," Willa said as she ate. The food was simple but good, cooked by someone who knew what they were doing. "You do not owe me anything," Thomas said, sitting down across from her with his own plate. "But we do need to talk about what happens next. You said raiders burned you out. Do you have anywhere else to go? Family in another territory?" Willa shook her head. "My mother died when I was 10. My father and brother were all I had left. I have an aunt somewhere back east, but I have not heard from her in years. I do not even know if she is still alive." Thomas was quiet for a moment, eating his breakfast and clearly thinking. "Williams is not much of a town," he finally said. "Maybe 300 people, and most of them are not particularly friendly. This cabin is outside the main settlement because that is how I prefer it. But there is a widow woman, Mrs. Patterson, who runs a boarding house. She might have room for you, at least until you figure out what you want to do." "I have no money," Willa admitted. "The raiders took everything, including the small amount of cash we had saved. I would need to find work, but I do not know what kind of work would be available for a woman alone." "You could work for Mrs. Patterson," Thomas suggested. "She is always complaining about needing help with the cooking and cleaning. It would not pay much, but it would be room and board. It was not a perfect solution, but it was better than nothing. Willa nodded slowly. That sounds like a possibility. But I should also tell you that I will not go back east, even if I could locate my aunt. This is my home now, this territory. My family is buried here. I may have lost the homestead, but I am not giving up on making a life out here. Something flickered in Thomas's eyes, something that might have been respect. That is a hard stance to take, he said, especially for a woman alone. I am tougher than I look, Willa said, lifting her chin. I helped my father and brother run that homestead for 3 years. I can shoot, I can ride, I can work as hard as any man. I just need a chance. Thomas studied her for a long moment, and Willa got the sense he was seeing past her bedraggled appearance to the steel underneath. Finally, he nodded. I believe you, he said. When you are ready, I will take you into town and introduce you to Mrs. Patterson. But there is no rush. The snow is still deep, and you need time to recover your strength. Over the next few days, a strange routine developed. Thomas went about his usual business, which seemed to consist of checking his small herd of cattle, repairing things around the cabin, and hunting. Willa helped where she could, cooking meals and mending clothes, grateful to have something to do besides sit and think about everything she had lost. They did not talk much at first. Thomas seemed unused to conversation, and Willa was still processing her grief. But slowly, in small moments, they began to open up to each other. Willa learned that Thomas had been a soldier during the Civil War, fighting for the Union. He had seen things that still haunted him, done things he was not proud of, and when the war ended, he had come west looking for solitude and a chance to forget. I was at Gettysburg, Thomas said one evening as they sat by the fire. Lost most of my company there. Good men, all of them. I made it through by pure luck, not skill or bravery, just luck, and I have been asking myself ever since why I lived when they died. That is survivor's guilt, Willa said softly. My mother's sister lost her husband in a mining accident, and she said the same thing. Why him and not her? But the truth is, there is no answer. Bad things happen, and we cannot always understand why. Thomas looked at her, really looked at her, and Willa felt something shift between them. It was not attraction, not yet, but recognition. They were both wounded people, both carrying grief and guilt, and somehow that created a connection. You are wise for someone so young, Thomas said. I am not that young, Willa protested. I am 22, and you cannot be more than 28 or 29. 27, Thomas admitted, but I feel about 100 years old most days. Then we are a pair of ancient souls, Willa said with a small smile, worn out before our time. For the first time since Willa had met him, Thomas almost smiled. It did not quite make it to his lips, but his eyes softened, and the hard lines of his face relaxed just a fraction. It transformed him, making him look younger and more approachable. As the days passed, Willa found herself noticing things about Thomas that had nothing to do with gratitude for him saving her life. The way his hands moved with careful precision when he was repairing something. The patience he showed with the animals. The intelligence in his eyes when he read in the evenings, working his way through what turned out to be a surprisingly extensive collection of books. I never learned to read well, Willa admitted one night, watching him turn pages. My father taught me the basics, but we never had many books, and there was always so much work to do. Thomas looked up, surprised. Would you like to learn properly? I have plenty of books, and it would give us something to do in the evenings. And so another routine was established. After supper, Thomas would sit with Willa at the table, helping her work through increasingly difficult texts. He was a patient teacher, never making her feel stupid when she struggled with a word, always encouraging her progress. Willa found herself looking forward to these evenings more than anything else, and she suspected it was not just because of the reading. Thomas had a way of looking at her when she got something right, a warmth in his eyes that made her heart beat faster. And sometimes, when he leaned close to point out something in the text, she could smell the clean scent of soap and leather that clung to him, could feel the warmth radiating from his body, and she had to fight the urge to lean closer. It was during one of these reading lessons, about 2 weeks after Willa had arrived, that everything changed. They were working on a passage from a novel about the sea, and Willa was concentrating hard on a particularly difficult word. Thomas had moved his chair closer to hers so he could see the book better, and their shoulders were almost touching. Harbor, Willa sounded out. Harbor, a place where ships dock. Exactly right, Thomas said, and there was such genuine pleasure in his voice that Willa looked up at him with a bright smile. Their faces were only inches apart. Willa could see the flecks of darker gray in Thomas's storm cloud eyes, could count the individual lashes framing them. She could see the faint stubble already growing back on his jaw and the small scar through his eyebrow. And she could see something else, something that made her breath catch in her throat. He was looking at her the way a man looks at a woman he desires. For a moment, neither of them moved. The air between them felt charged, electric with possibility. Then Thomas pulled back abruptly, standing up from his chair so fast that it scraped against the floor. "I think that is enough for tonight," he said, his voice rough. "You did well." He retreated to his bedroll without another word, lying down with his back to her. Willa sat at the table, her heart pounding, her hands trembling slightly as she closed the book. Something had shifted between them, something significant, and she did not know whether to be thrilled or terrified. That night, lying in Thomas's bed while he slept by the fire, Willa forced herself to think clearly about her situation. She was attracted to Thomas Fletcher, there was no denying that. And unless she was very much mistaken, he was attracted to her too. But what could possibly come of it? She was a woman with nothing, not even a change of clothes to her name. He was a man who had clearly chosen isolation, who had built walls around himself to keep the world out. Still, she could not help but remember the way he had looked at her, or the gentleness in his hands when he helped her with something. Thomas Fletcher might be lonely and haunted, but he was also kind and intelligent and honorable. He had saved her life when no one else would, and then he had given her a place to stay without asking for anything in return. In the morning, things were awkward between them. Thomas was even quieter than usual, and he seemed to be going out of his way to avoid being close to Willa. She felt a pang of hurt, wondering if he regretted whatever had almost happened the night before. "I think it is time I took you into town to meet Mrs. Patterson," Thomas said abruptly over breakfast. "The snow has melted enough that the roads are passable. You should have options beyond staying here in my cabin." The words stung more than they should have. "Of course," Willa said, keeping her voice level. "You have been more than generous with your time and space. I am sure you will be glad to have your home to yourself again." Thomas's jaw tightened, but he did not contradict her. After breakfast, he saddled his horse, a sturdy bay gelding, and helped Willa up behind him. She had to wrap her arms around his waist to stay seated, and she tried not to notice the solid feel of him beneath her hands, or the way her body fit against his back. The ride into Williams proper took about 20 minutes. In daylight and without a blizzard obscuring everything, Willa could see that it was indeed a small town, just a main street with buildings on either side and a few houses scattered around the outskirts. She recognized the doors she had knocked on during that desperate night and felt a surge of gratitude toward Thomas all over again. Mrs. Patterson's boarding house was a 2-story building painted white, with a wide porch and lace curtains in the windows. Thomas helped Willa down from the horse, his hands careful on her waist, and then led her up to the front door. He knocked, and a moment later, a woman in her 50s answered. She was plump and kind-looking, with graying hair pulled back in a bun and flour on her apron. Her eyes widened when she saw Thomas. "Fletcher," she said, surprise evident in her voice. "I do not think you have been to town in 6 months. What brings you here?" "I need a favor, Mrs. Patterson," Thomas said. "This is Willa Bennett. She had some trouble with raiders, lost her family and her homestead. She needs a place to stay and work. I thought you might have room for her." Mrs. Patterson's expression immediately shifted from surprise to sympathy. "Oh, you poor dear," she said, taking Willa's hands in her own. "Of course I have room. I always need help around here, especially with the cooking. The miners and cowboys who stay here eat like horses, and my back is not what it used to be." Relief flooded through Willa. "Thank you," she said. "I promise I will work hard. I am a good cook, and I do not mind long hours." "I am sure we will get along just fine," Mrs. Patterson said warmly. She glanced at Thomas, and something shrewd came into her eyes. "It was kind of you to bring her, Fletcher. Will you stay for coffee?" "No, thank you," Thomas said, already backing toward his horse. "I should get back. I have cattle to tend." He mounted up without looking at Willa, and for a moment she thought he was just going to ride away. But then he paused and finally met her eyes. "You take care of yourself, Miss Bennett," he said quietly. "Thank you for everything, Mr. Fletcher," Willa said, trying to keep the emotion out of her voice. "I will never forget what you did for me." Thomas nodded once, then turned his horse and rode away. Willa watched him go, feeling an inexplicable sense of loss as he disappeared from view. "Come inside, dear," Mrs. Patterson said gently. "Let me show you around and get you settled." The next few weeks passed in a blur of work. Mrs. Patterson's boarding house was indeed busy. With a rotating cast of miners, cowboys, and traveling salesmen who needed rooms and meals. Willa threw herself into the work, cooking massive breakfasts and dinners, washing sheets and scrubbing floors, grateful for the exhaustion that let her sleep at night without thinking too much. But she could not stop thinking about Thomas Fletcher. She wondered if he was all right out there in his isolated cabin, if he was eating properly, if he thought about her at all. Mrs. Patterson had tried to draw Willa out about their relationship, clearly curious about what had happened, but Willa had deflected her questions. What could she say? That she had feelings for a man she barely knew, who had made it clear he wanted to be alone. Then, 3 weeks after Willa had moved into the boarding house, Thomas came to town. Willa saw him from the kitchen window, riding down the main street on his bay gelding. Her heart leapt into her throat, and she found herself smoothing her hair and wiping her hands on her apron, suddenly self-conscious. "Looks like Fletcher has business in town," Mrs. Patterson said, coming to stand beside Willa at the window. "That is twice in a month. Practically a social butterfly by his standards." "He probably needs supplies," Willa said, trying to sound casual. "Probably," Mrs. Patterson agreed, but there was a knowing look in her eyes that made Willa blush. Willa went back to kneading bread dough, trying not to think about Thomas just down the street. But about an hour later there was a knock on the boarding house's front door, and when Mrs. Patterson answered it, Willa heard Thomas's voice. "Is Miss Bennett available?" he was asking. "I would like to speak with her if she has time." Willa's hands stilled in the dough, her heart pounding. Mrs. Patterson called her name, and Willa quickly wiped her hands clean and went to the door, trying to calm her racing pulse. Thomas stood on the porch, his hat in his hands, looking uncomfortable. "Miss Bennett," he said formally, "I apologize for interrupting your work. I wanted to see how you were settling in." "I am doing well," Willa said, acutely aware of Mrs. Patterson hovering just inside the door, pretending not to listen. "Mrs. Patterson has been very kind, and I enjoy the work." "That is good," Thomas said. He fell silent, seeming to struggle with something. Finally, he said, "I was wondering if you might take a walk with me, just for a few minutes. I have something I would like to say to you." Willa glanced back at Mrs. Patterson, who immediately shooed her toward the door. "Go on, dear. The bread can wait. Take your time." Willa grabbed a shawl and stepped out onto the porch, and Thomas immediately started walking, clearly wanting to get away from the boarding house before he spoke. They walked in silence to the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to open prairie, and then Thomas finally stopped and turned to face her. "I owe you an apology," he said abruptly. "I was rude to you before you left. I made you feel like you were a burden when that was not the case at all. The truth is—" He paused, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "The truth is, I sent you away because I was scared." "Scared of what?" Willa asked softly. "Of the way you make me feel," Thomas admitted, looking her straight in the eye. "I have been alone for a long time, Miss Bennett. I chose that loneliness because it felt safer than letting anyone close enough to hurt me again. But then you knocked on my door in that blizzard, and you have been disrupting my carefully maintained isolation ever since." Willa's breath caught. "And is that a bad thing?" she asked. "I do not know," Thomas said honestly. "Part of me thinks I have nothing to offer you. I am just a broken-down soldier with a small cabin and a few head of cattle. You deserve better than that. But another part of me thinks I will regret it for the rest of my life if I do not at least try to see if there could be something between us." Joy and hope surged through Willa's chest, so strong it almost hurt. "Mr. Fletcher," she said, stepping closer to him. "Thomas, you are not broken. You are hurt, yes, and lonely, but you are also kind and brave and good. You saved my life when no one else would. You gave me shelter and asked for nothing in return. You taught me to read better and made me laugh when I thought I would never laugh again. How could you think you have nothing to offer?" Thomas's eyes searched her face as if looking for any sign of deception. "You really believe that?" he asked. "I do," Willa said firmly. "And I will admit something to you. I think about you constantly. I wonder if you are all right, if you are lonely, if you ever think about me. I know we have not known each other long, but there is something between us, Thomas. I feel it, and I think you feel it too." "I do," Thomas admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "God help me, I do. You are the first person in years who has made me feel like maybe I could have a life again, instead of just existence." "Then why are we fighting it?" Willa asked, reaching out to take his hand. His fingers closed around hers, strong and warm, and the contact sent a thrill through her entire body. "Because I am terrified of losing you," Thomas said quietly. "This territory is dangerous, Willa. I lost everything in the war. If I let myself care about you and then something happens, then we will have had something beautiful for however long it lasts," Willa interrupted. "Life does not come with guarantees, Thomas. I lost my father and brother. You lost your friends in the war. We both know how precious and fragile life is, which is why we should not waste a single moment of it." Thomas stared at her for a long moment, and then, slowly, a real smile spread across his face. It transformed him completely, erasing years of sadness and making him look young and hopeful. "When did you get so wise?" he asked. "I had a good teacher," Willa said, smiling back at him. "Someone who taught me that words have power, and that learning never stops." Thomas lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. The gesture was old-fashioned and courtly, and it made Willa's heart flutter. "Then I suppose I should court you properly," he said. "With your permission, Miss Bennett, I would like to call on you. Take you to dinners and dances. Let the whole town see that I am trying to win your affections." "You already have my affections," Willa said. but I would very much like to be courted by you, Mr. Fletcher." And so began the strangest and most wonderful courtship Willa could have imagined. Thomas came to town every few days, always bringing some small gift for her, a wildflower he had found on the prairie, or a book he thought she might enjoy. He took her to dinner at Williams's only restaurant, and to the dances that were held in the community hall on Saturday nights. At first, the townspeople did not know what to make of it. Thomas Fletcher was a mystery to most of them, the hermit who lived outside of town and rarely interacted with anyone. But Willa could see them warming up to him as the weeks passed, as they saw how gentle he was with her, how he looked at her like she was the most precious thing in the world. For her part, Willa fell more in love with Thomas every day. She loved the way he listened when she talked, really listened, as if everything she said was important. She loved his dry sense of humor that emerged once he felt comfortable. She loved his hands, so strong and capable, and the way they were always gentle when they touched her. She loved his mind, the intelligence that shone through when he talked about books or history or the world. But most of all, she loved the way he was opening up, like a flower that had been closed against the winter and was finally feeling safe enough to bloom. He told her more about his time in the war, the friends he had lost, the things he had seen that still gave him nightmares. He told her about his childhood in Pennsylvania, about his parents who had died of fever before the war, about his sister who had moved to California and with whom he had lost touch. And Willa told him about her own life, about growing up on various homesteads as her father chased the dream of finding the perfect place to settle, about her mother's slow decline from consumption and how Willa had nursed her until the end, about her brother, only 15 when the raiders killed him, who had wanted to be a teacher someday. They were healing each other, Willa realized. Slowly, carefully, they were helping each other put back together the pieces that grief and trauma had shattered. One evening in late spring, about 4 months after Willa had first knocked on Thomas's door, he took her for a walk along the creek that ran just outside of Williams. The air was warm and sweet with the smell of prairie flowers, and the sun was setting in a blaze of orange and gold. "I have been thinking," Thomas said as they walked hand in hand, "about the future, about what I want my life to look like." "And what do you want?" Willa asked, her heart beating faster. Thomas stopped walking and turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "I want you," he said simply. "I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep beside you every night. I want to build a real home with you, not just a cabin to exist in, but a place full of life and love. I want children with you if we are blessed with them. I want to grow old with you. I want everything, Willa, as much as life will give us." Tears sprang to Willa's eyes. "I want all of that too," she whispered. "Then marry me," Thomas said, and he dropped to one knee right there beside the creek, still holding her hands. "I do not have a ring yet, and I know I should probably do this properly with flowers and romance, but I cannot wait another moment. Willa Bennett, will you marry me? Will you take a chance on a lonely cowboy who loves you more than he thought it was possible to love anyone?" "Yes," Willa said, the tears spilling over now. "Yes, Thomas, I will marry you. I love you so much." Thomas surged to his feet and pulled her into his arms, and then he was kissing her for the first time. It was gentle and sweet and passionate all at once, a kiss that held all the promise of their future together. Willa wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him back with everything she had, pouring all her love and hope into it. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. "I am the luckiest man alive," he said. "The night you knocked on my door was the best thing that ever happened to me." "We saved each other," Willa said softly. "You saved my life that night, but I think maybe I saved yours too in a different way." You absolutely did, Thomas agreed. I was not really living before you came along, just existing, waiting for time to pass. You reminded me that life is worth living, that there is still beauty and joy in the world. They were married 3 weeks later, on a beautiful June day in the small church in Williams. Mrs. Patterson insisted on organizing everything, declaring that after all Willa had been through, she deserved a proper wedding. The whole town turned out for it, curious about the match between the hermit cowboy and the young woman who had appeared in a blizzard. Willa wore a simple white dress that Mrs. Patterson had helped her make, and she carried a bouquet of wildflowers that Thomas had picked that morning. Thomas wore a new suit that he had ordered from back east, and he looked so handsome that Willa's breath caught when she first saw him standing at the altar. The ceremony was short and sweet, and when the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Thomas kissed Willa with such tenderness that several of the women in attendance sighed. Afterward, there was a celebration at the boarding house, with music and dancing and more food than Willa had seen in months. But eventually, Thomas and Willa were able to slip away, riding double on his bay, gelding back to the cabin that was now their home. Thomas had been working hard over the past weeks to fix it up, adding little touches that made it feel more like a home and less like a place to survive. He had built new shelves and brought in wildflowers for the table. He had ordered a bigger bed and new linens. He had even hung curtains in the window when they arrived. Thomas lifted Willa down from the horse and then, without warning, swept her up into his arms. "I am carrying my bride over the threshold," he announced, grinning at her startled laugh. He kicked the door open and carried her inside, setting her down gently in the middle of the room. Then he stood back and looked at her, his eyes dark with love and desire. "Hello, wife," he said softly. "Hello, husband," Willa replied, her heart so full she thought it might burst. They came together in a rush, kissing with all the passion they had been holding back during their courtship. Thomas's hands were in her hair, cradling her head as he kissed her deeply. Willa's fingers worked at the buttons of his shirt, desperate to feel his skin against hers. They made love that night with all the tenderness and passion of two people who had found each other against all odds. Thomas was gentle with Willa, knowing it was her first time, whispering words of love and reassurance as he showed her the pleasures that awaited them. And Willa gave herself to him completely, trusting him with her body and her heart. Afterward, they lay tangled together in their new bed, Willa's head resting on Thomas's chest as his fingers traced lazy patterns on her back. "I never thought I would have this," Thomas murmured into her hair. "A wife, a real home, a reason to wake up happy in the morning." "Thank you for giving me all of that." "You do not need to thank me," Willa said, tilting her head to kiss his jaw. "This is as much a gift to me as it is to you. We are building a life together, Thomas. A good life." "The best life," Thomas agreed, holding her closer. The months that followed were perhaps the happiest of Willa's life. She and Thomas fell into an easy rhythm, working together to improve the cabin and the small ranch. Thomas built an addition to the cabin, creating a separate bedroom and a larger living space. He expanded the barn and bought more cattle, working to build a herd that could sustain them. Willa planted a garden and started raising chickens. She continued to improve her reading, working her way through all of Thomas's books and then ordering more from back east. She learned to truly love this harsh, beautiful territory with its endless skies and rolling prairies. But more than any of that, she loved her life with Thomas. She loved the way he always kissed her goodbye when he left to check the cattle, and the way he kissed her hello when he returned. She loved sitting with him in the evenings, reading or talking or just being together in comfortable silence. She loved the way he made her laugh with his dry humor, and the way he held her when she had bad dreams about the night the raiders came. And she loved the passion between them, which only grew stronger as the months passed. Thomas was an attentive lover, always making sure Willa found pleasure before taking his own. He learned what she liked, what made her gasp and moan his name, and he took great delight in discovering new ways to bring her joy. In the spring of 1878, a year after their marriage, Willa realized she was pregnant. She waited until she was sure before telling Thomas, and when she finally did, his reaction was everything she could have hoped for. He picked her up and spun her around, laughing with pure joy, and then set her down carefully as if she were made of glass. "We are going to have a baby," he kept saying, wonder in his voice. "I am going to be a father." "You are going to be a wonderful father," Willa assured him, "just like you are a wonderful husband." Thomas became even more protective of Willa during her pregnancy, always worrying that she was working too hard or not eating enough. Willa found it endearing, even when it was a bit smothering. She knew it came from a place of love and fear, from Thomas's terror of losing her or the baby. "I am tough, remember," she would tell him when he fretted too much. "I survived a blizzard and raiders and grief. I can handle having a baby." Their son was born on a cold December morning in 1878, after a long labor that terrified Thomas but that Willa bore with gritted teeth and determination. Mrs. Patterson came out to the cabin to help with the delivery, and when she finally placed the squalling infant in Thomas's arms, tears streamed down his face. "He is perfect," Thomas whispered, staring down at his son in awe. "Willa, look at him. He is perfect." They named him James William Fletcher, after Thomas's father and Willa's brother. He had Thomas's dark hair and Willa's blue eyes, and he was indeed perfect. Thomas took to fatherhood with the same intensity he brought to everything else, rocking James for hours when he cried and changing his diapers without complaint. Willa would often wake in the night to find Thomas standing by the cradle, just watching their son sleep with an expression of profound wonder on his face. "I never thought I deserved this kind of happiness," Thomas told her one night, after they had gotten James back to sleep following a particularly difficult evening. "A family, a home, a purpose. Sometimes I am afraid I will wake up and it will all have been a dream." "It is real," Willa assured him, taking his hand. "We are real. This life we have built is real. And you do deserve it, Thomas. You deserve every bit of happiness that comes your way." The years passed in a blur of hard work and deep satisfaction. James grew into a bright, curious boy who loved following his father around the ranch and listening to his mother read. 2 years after James was born, Willa gave birth to a daughter they named Sarah Mee. She had Willa's dark hair and Thomas's gray eyes, and she was as tough as her mother and as gentle as her father. Thomas expanded the ranch steadily, building their herd and their reputation. He became known as a fair man who dealt honestly, and other ranchers began seeking him out for advice and partnership. The isolated hermit who had once wanted nothing to do with the world became a respected member of the community. Willa started teaching reading lessons to some of the other women in Williams, sharing the gift that Thomas had given her. She also became known for her cooking, and people would travel from miles around to get her preserves and baked goods. But despite all their success, Thomas and Willa never forgot where they had started. Every winter, on the anniversary of the night Willa had knocked on Thomas's door, they would make a special dinner and toast to the blizzard that had brought them together. "To desperate circumstances and answered prayers," Thomas would say, raising his glass. "To the loneliest cowboy who decided not to be lonely anymore," Willa would reply, clinking her glass against his. When James was 10 and Sarah was 8, they had another child, a second son they named Peter Thomas. He was a surprise, coming along when Willa thought her childbearing years were behind her, but he was a welcome surprise. Thomas was just as devoted to Peter as he had been to their first two children, and Willa loved watching him play with all three of them, rolling in the grass and telling them stories about the world. The ranch continued to prosper. By 1890, they had one of the larger herds in the territory, and they had hired several ranch hands to help with the work. The cabin had been expanded twice more and was now a proper house, with multiple bedrooms and a large kitchen where Willa could cook the big meals their growing family required. James grew up to be a serious, thoughtful young man who was fascinated by law and eventually went back east to study to become a lawyer. Sarah turned out to have a gift for numbers and took over much of the ranch's bookkeeping, showing a head for business that impressed everyone. Peter was the most like Thomas, quiet and steady, and he loved working with the cattle through it all. Thomas and Willa's love never wavered. If anything, it grew deeper and richer with time, like a well-aged wine. They had their disagreements, of course, as any couple did, but they always worked through them. They had learned early on that life was too short and too precious to waste on grudges or stubbornness. In the evenings, after the children were grown and had started their own lives, Thomas and Willa would sit on the porch they had built, looking out over the ranch they had created together. Thomas would take Willa's hand, his fingers still strong despite the arthritis that was starting to set in, and they would watch the sun set over the prairie. "You ever regret it?" Thomas asked one evening. "Knocking on my door that night. I was the 10th house you tried." What if one of the others had answered, "You might have had a different life, maybe an easier one." "I do not believe in easier," Willa said, squeezing his hand. "I believe in right, and you were the right door to knock on, Thomas. You were always meant to answer." I think some part of me knew that, even in the middle of that blizzard. I was not just looking for shelter. I was looking for home, and I found it with you. Thomas brought her hand to his lips and kissed it, just as he had done all those years ago when he had first asked to court her. "I was the loneliest man in Montana territory," he said softly. "Maybe in the whole West, and then you appeared like an angel in the snow and you saved me." "We saved each other," Willa corrected, as she always did. "That is what love does. It saves us from ourselves, from our loneliness and our fear. It gives us a reason to be brave." As the years continued to pass, Thomas and Willa became pillars of the Williams community. They were the couple everyone pointed to as an example of true love. The hermit and the woman who had knocked on his door in a blizzard and changed both their lives forever. Their children grew and had children of their own, and Thomas and Willa found joy in being grandparents, spoiling their grandchildren in ways they had never been able to spoil their own children. When Thomas was 67 and Willa was 62, Thomas fell ill with pneumonia. It came on suddenly, during a particularly harsh winter, and despite Willa's devoted nursing and the doctor's best efforts, he did not recover. He died in their bed, with Willa holding his hand, just as they had held hands through all the years of their marriage. "I love you," Thomas whispered with his last breath. "Thank you for answering my door." "I love you too," Willa whispered back, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you for opening it." After Thomas died, their children worried that Willa would not be able to go on without him. They tried to convince her to come live with one of them, to leave the ranch that held so many memories. But Willa refused. "This is my home," she told them gently. "Mine and your father's. We built this life together, and I am not leaving it just because he is gone. He is still here with me, in every board of this house, in every blade of grass on this prairie. I feel him everywhere, and I am not ready to leave that behind." So Willa stayed on the ranch, with Peter and his family living close by to help her. She continued her routines, tending her garden and cooking her meals and reading the books that lined the shelves. And every evening, she would sit on the porch and look out over the land she and Thomas had built together, and she would talk to him as if he were still sitting beside her. "I miss you," she would say. "Every single day I miss you, but I am not lonely, my love. You gave me so much, a family and a home and a purpose. You taught me that love can heal the deepest wounds and that it is never too late to start living, and I will carry that with me until the day I die." Willa lived another 15 years after Thomas's death, long enough to see all her grandchildren grown and to meet several great-grandchildren. She remained sharp and active until the very end, still teaching reading to anyone who wanted to learn, still cooking meals for the family gatherings they held every Sunday. And when she finally passed, quietly in her sleep at the age of 77, her family found a letter she had written to be read at her funeral. In it, she told the story of that desperate night in the blizzard when she had knocked on 10 doors and only one had answered. She wrote about how that single moment of answered prayer had changed everything, had given her a life beyond her wildest dreams. She wrote about Thomas, about his kindness and his strength and his capacity for love. She wrote about their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, about the ranch they had built and the community they had been part of. She wrote about the joy and the sorrow, the triumphs and the struggles, all the things that made up a life fully lived. And at the end of the letter she wrote, "I knocked on 10 doors in the snow, and only the loneliest cowboy answered. But that loneliest cowboy became the love of my life, and together we made something beautiful. We took our grief and our fear and our loneliness and we turned it into hope and family and home. That is what love does. It transforms us. It saves us. It makes us whole. And I am grateful every single day of my life that Thomas Fletcher opened his door to a desperate stranger in a blizzard. Because in doing so, he opened his heart to me, and I opened mine to him. And together we created something that will last long after we are both gone." The ranch stayed in the Fletcher family for generations after that, a testament to what Thomas and Willa had built together. And in Williams, Montana, the story of the hermit cowboy and the woman in the blizzard became legend, passed down through the years as an example of how love can find us in the most unexpected moments, and how a single act of kindness can change everything. The cabin where it all began, the 10th door that had finally opened, was preserved as part of the ranch, and Willa's descendants made sure it stayed standing. Inside, they kept some of Thomas and Willa's belongings, the books they had read together and the table where they had shared so many meals. And on the door, they hung a plaque that read, "Here, on a winter night in 1877, 2 lonely souls found each other. Their love story began with a knock on a door and lasted a lifetime. May we all be brave enough to open doors for strangers in need and wise enough to recognize love when it finds us." And so the story ended, not with sadness but with celebration, because Thomas and Willa had proven that even in the harsh, unforgiving landscape of the Wild West, love could flourish. Even in the depths of grief and loneliness, hope could be found. And even when 9 doors stayed closed, sometimes all it took was one door opening to change everything. Their love story became part of the fabric of Williams, Montana, a reminder to everyone who heard it that we are never truly alone as long as we are willing to open our hearts. That the loneliest among us can find connection and joy. That it is never too late to start living, to let someone in, to build something beautiful. Thomas Fletcher had been the loneliest cowboy in Montana territory, and Willa Bennett had been a desperate woman fleeing tragedy. But together, they became something more. They became a family, a home, a legacy. They became proof that love is worth the risk, that opening your heart is worth the possibility of pain because the rewards are so much greater. And generations later, when their great-great-grandchildren gathered at the ranch for reunions, they would walk past that cabin with its commemorative plaque, and they would tell their own children the story. The story of how their family began with a blizzard and a knock on a door. The story of how sometimes the best things in life come when we are brave enough to ask for help and kind enough to give it. The story of how Willa knocked on 10 doors in the snow, and only the loneliest cowboy answered, and how that single moment created a love that echoed through the ages, inspiring everyone who heard it to be a little braver, a little kinder, and a little more willing to open their doors to the possibility of love.